The morning sky over Chicago was still painted in shades of gray as Rose Keaton stepped out of the L train and made her way toward Wellington Global's towering headquarters. Wind whipped her coat open, but she clutched it tight and pressed on. She arrived before most of the city stirred, just the way she liked it. Inside the marble and glass lobby, security nodded her through. She took the elevator up to the 38th floor, where the heartbeat of the company pulsed, the strategy division. Rose slid behind her desk, powered on her monitor, and sipped her coffee. Organized, efficient, focused. That's how she earned her place. No shortcuts, no scandals, just sweat and strategy. 2 years earlier, when she first walked into the building as a hopeful hire, Rose was stunned by how polished and impenetrable the Wellington world seemed. The corporate elite dressed in subtle status, tailored navy suits, Rolex watches, smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. She'd spent weeks trying to figure out where she fit in. She found her answer during a corporate retreat in Lake Geneva. A storm had canceled the second day's events, and most execs disappeared to their rooms or laptops. Rose had opted for a walk by the lake, hood up, headphones in, when she nearly collided with someone stepping out of a small dockhouse. "Oh, so sorry," she said, startled, nearly dropping her phone. He smiled, charming but unassuming. "You okay?" She nodded. "Didn't expect anyone to be out here." He held up a book, needed some air and less small talk. They walked together that day, talking about everything but work. It wasn't until dinner that she realized who he was. Van Wellington, the CEO's son, usually stationed at the New York headquarters. She'd expected a spoiled executive clone. He turned out to be different, thoughtful, a little restless, and somehow real. Over the next year, Van's trips to Chicago became more frequent, officially for project oversight, unofficially to see her. They kept it quiet. Dinners at tucked-away bistros, long phone calls while he was abroad, private weekends in places no one would think to look. "You know this can't be public," Van told her, brushing her hair back as they lay curled on her couch. "I know," she whispered, "but it's still real, right?" He kissed her hand. "More real than anything else I've ever had." When Van got the assignment to oversee the Singapore expansion, it felt like their relationship was entering a new phase. He promised to return in a year, then they could be open. Then they could figure out what this really was. Rose stood at the airport as he boarded his flight, a tight smile on her face, arms wrapped around her midsection. "Don't disappear on me," she joked, forcing lightness. "Never," he said. "You're the only thing I know for sure." A few weeks later, something shifted. Rose noticed it in small things: fatigue she couldn't shake, cravings that made no sense. When she missed her second cycle, she didn't panic. She just knew. Alone in the women's bathroom on the 38th floor, she stared at the positive test. Her heart pounded. A child. His child. She sat on the edge of the sink, the office's sterile hum ringing in her ears. There was no way to reach Van, not directly. He was in meetings non-stop, traveling between Singapore and Jakarta. And she didn't want to tell him over a phone screen. "I'll wait," she whispered to herself. "I'll keep my head down, do my work, and tell him when he gets back." She hadn't yet realized. Someone else already knew. She's been watching them from the beginning. And that someone had plans to make her disappear. The office air was crisper than usual. Rose couldn't shake the feeling she was being watched. She focused on her screen, fingers moving methodically through financial projections for a healthcare acquisition. She hadn't told anyone, not even Karen, about the pregnancy. She was still wrapping her own mind around it. But she'd started wearing looser clothes, drinking decaf, and avoiding the company happy hours. Just until Van returned. But someone had noticed the shift. And her name was Carolina Wellington. Carolina stood like a shadow in her corner office on the 40th floor, arms crossed, watching through the floor-to-ceiling glass. She had always kept an eye on Rose, not out of admiration, but out of instinct. Rose was efficient, smart. A little too smart. The kind of girl men fell for when they forgot the rules. And Van had never been good at remembering rules. When Carolina's private investigator handed her the medical appointment receipts and prescription records, her worst suspicions were confirmed. Pregnant, Unmarried. Wellington blood at risk. Carolina didn't flinch. She made a call. Rose was summoned to HR the next day. The email was sterile, the tone even colder. As she sat in the bland, windowless conference room, she felt a creeping unease crawl up her spine. The director of human resources, a man who had always smiled warmly in the hallway, now refused to meet her eyes. "Rose, this is difficult," he began, glancing at a thick manila folder. "There have been concerns raised about your conduct." "Conduct?" she repeated, confused. "Specifically regarding boundaries with senior executives and conflicts of interest." She blinked. "Are you accusing me of something?" "We're offering a severance package," he said instead, "and a non-disclosure agreement. It would be best for everyone if you signed today." Her heart dropped. "This is about Van." He flinched, just slightly. "I can't comment on that." Rose's hands trembled. "I haven't broken any company policies. Van and I—" "Don't say his name," a new voice cut in. Carolina entered the room like a queen entering court, uninvited, unshaken. Her tailored gray dress was sharp enough to slice skin. "You knew better," she said calmly, setting a folder on the table. "And now this is where it ends." Rose's eyes flashed. "You don't scare me." "Oh, I'm not trying to," Carolina replied coolly. "But your reputation, your future? I suggest you take what's offered. It's more kindness than you deserve." That night, Rose went home to Karen and collapsed on the floor. "They fired you?" Karen cried, kneeling beside her. "They can't do that. This is retaliation." Rose couldn't even speak. She just handed over the severance agreement with shaking hands. "They said if I fight it, they'll leak personal emails, accuse me of trading intimacy for promotions." Karen's eyes filled with fury. This is Carolina, that witch has been protecting the family image for years. She's cleaned up worse. "I was trying to protect Van," Rose whispered. "I thought if I waited, he'd fix it." Karen took her hand. "Sweetheart, he can't fix what he doesn't know." 2 weeks later, Rose found herself evicted from the corporate apartment she once called home. No job, no severance check, because she didn't sign. She refused to be silent. She stayed with Karen for a while, trying to find work, but every interview ended the same. "We'll be in touch." Then silence. Her name had been blacklisted. She applied for jobs outside of the business world, event planning, hospitality, even admin work, but nothing stuck. One recruiter quietly confided, "You've made enemies in high places." Rose could see it happening, subtly, quietly, but undeniably. Karen's boss began excluding her from strategy meetings. Her name disappeared from city event planning lists. And then came the late-night call from an anonymous number warning her, "Your roommate's choices could cost you your future." Karen didn't say anything at first, but Rose noticed the worry in her eyes, the tension in her voice. One night, while they sat quietly watching the city lights from their balcony, Rose broke the silence. "I think I should go." Karen turned sharply. "What?" "No, Rose, don't let them bully you into running." Rose forced a smile. "I'm not running. A distant cousin in Springfield said I could stay with her for a bit, just until I sort things out." It was a lie. There was no cousin. But Rose couldn't risk Karen's job too. She'd already lost everything. She wouldn't take Karen down with her. She left the next morning before dawn. By her 5th month of pregnancy, Rose was sleeping in a shelter for single women and preparing to give birth alone. Still, she refused to contact Van. Not yet. Not until she could face him with the full story. Not until she knew whether he would stand beside her or behind his family. She carried her belly like a shield, and every night she scribbled in a notebook, letters to her unborn child, a record of truth. At St. Felicity's Women's Shelter, Rose found a thin mattress, a warm meal, and something she hadn't felt in weeks: stillness. The director, a kind but firm woman named Gloria, offered quiet support without pity. When she saw Rose's resume, Gloria gave her a lead. A local business owner was looking for a remote virtual assistant. Data entry, scheduling, inbox management, nothing glamorous, but honest work she could do on her old laptop. Rose took the job gratefully, her fingers flying over the keys late into the night while others around her slept. She still wrote in her notebook, documenting every detail, every lie, every moment of strength. She told herself, "This is temporary," because Van was coming back. And when he did, He would learn everything. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime on the 40th floor of Wellington Global. The energy on the executive level stilled for a moment as Van Wellington stepped off, freshly returned from Singapore, eyes sharp, jaw tense. He hadn't heard from Rose in weeks, texts left unread, phone calls that never connected. At first, he thought maybe she was busy, maybe she was giving him space. But now something felt off, wrong. He headed straight for Carolina Wellington's office without waiting for an invitation. She looked up from her desk, composed as ever. "Van," she said evenly, "I expected you back tomorrow." He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Where's Rose?" Carolina blinked once. "Excuse me?" "Rose Keaton. I've tried to reach her for weeks. Now I'm told she no longer works here." Carolina folded her hands. Rose's tenure at Wellington ended several months ago. "Ended?" Van echoed, disbelief lacing his tone. "Why? She was one of the best we had." "There were performance concerns," she said coolly. "Nothing dramatic." She resigned quietly. Van frowned. "That doesn't sound like her." Carolina stood and moved around her desk slowly. "Van, your time in Singapore was crucial. The last thing you needed was distractions from back home." "You knew about us," he said flatly. She didn't answer. "What did you do, Carolina?" Carolina's eyes hardened. "I protected you, and I protected this family's name." Van's voice rose. "You forced her out, you pushed her away and then scrubbed her clean from the company. Why?" Carolina met his gaze with chilling calm. "Because she was becoming a liability." Van's chest tightened. He stepped back, disgust written all over his face. She didn't deserve this. Later that night, Van sat in his condo, staring blankly out the window. The skyline reflecting off the glass like a mirror of every mistake he'd made. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through old messages from Rose. Her last one was brief. "Hope you're doing okay over there. I'll catch you up soon." But she never did. Driven by instinct, he called Karen Ellis. Her voice was cautious when she answered. "Van? I need to find Rose. She's not answering. Carolina's being vague as hell. I know you two are close." Karen hesitated. "Please," Van said, his voice raw now. "I don't know what happened. Haven't heard from Rose in weeks." Karen exhaled shakily. "Rose told me she was going to live with family, but she's not with family. That was a lie." Van's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "They threatened my job because I let her stay with me. Rose left to protect me." Her voice cracked. "She's pregnant, Van." Van stood frozen, unable to breathe. "I know she hadn't told you," Karen whispered. "Rose said she'd wait until you came back. She didn't want to complicate your trip." A long silence passed before Van spoke again. "Where is she?" The next morning, St. Felicity's women's shelter was quiet as Van walked through the front doors. He was dressed down. No suit, no entourage. Just a man with guilt weighing down his shoulders. The director, Gloria, spotted him immediately. "Can I help you?" she asked, stepping forward. "I'm looking for someone, Rose Keaton. I believe she's staying here," he said gently. Gloria narrowed her eyes. "And who are you to her?" Van hesitated. "I'm someone who failed her. I didn't know what happened until yesterday. I didn't know she was pregnant, or that she lost everything because of me." Gloria studied him with a sharp gaze, arms crossed. "That's a lot of weight to walk in here with." "I know," he said quietly, "but I need to make it right." Gloria said, "Rose didn't soften right away, doesn't trust easily anymore. I'm sorry, but she's not here anymore, and Rose didn't leave a forwarding address." His face fell. "But," Gloria continued, "she checks in every Friday for prenatal vitamins, groceries, small things. If you're serious about finding her, be here Friday, and don't come as a Wellington. Come as the man she loved." Van nodded slowly. "That's exactly who I intend to be." The shelter lobby was quiet when Van Wellington stepped inside that Friday afternoon. His heart pounded with every step, unsure if Rose would even show. He hadn't slept in 2 days, haunted by what Karen had told him, by what his aunt had done. Then he saw her. Rose, wrapped in a soft gray sweater, hand gently resting on her swollen belly, looked up from her seat in the waiting area. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she rose slowly. "Van," she said softly. He stepped toward her, unsure what he was allowed to do. Touch her? Apologize? Fall to his knees? She broke the silence. "You didn't know, did you, about the baby, about your aunt?" "No," his voice cracked. "I didn't. I would have never left if I had." Tears filled her eyes. "I didn't want to burden you." "You were never a burden," he said. "But letting you face this alone? That's the biggest failure of my life." She didn't pull away when he reached for her. And when she leaned into him, it wasn't out of weakness, it was out of a shared pain, finally given space to breathe. That evening, Rose sat curled up on the couch in Van's penthouse apartment, warm, safe, and in clean clothes for the first time in weeks. They talked for hours. About the baby, about the shelter she'd moved to after St. Felicity's, somewhere quieter, less watched. About the silence and the fear, and about Carolina. Van listened quietly, guilt heavy in his chest. "I thought I knew her," he said. "She practically raised me." "She thought she was protecting you," Rose said, "in her own way." Van shook his head. "No, she was protecting the name, not the people under it." The next morning, the sun had barely crested over the city skyline when Van Wellington stood on his balcony, phone clutched in his hand, thumb hovering over the call button. He'd barely slept. Rose was asleep inside, curled up in his bed, her face soft in the early light, one arm resting protectively over her belly, the belly he couldn't stop looking at now. Every glance reminded him of what he'd nearly lost, what his family had tried to erase. Finally, he pressed the number. The phone rang twice before the gravelly voice of his father, Douglas Wellington, answered. "Van?" Douglas sounded alert, though clearly caught off guard by the early call. "I need to talk to you," Van said, the words tumbling out, low and heavy, about Rose. There was a pause. Douglas exhaled slowly. "What about her?" "She's the woman I love," Van said firmly, "and she's pregnant, with my child." Silence. Long, weighted silence. Van waited, heart hammering. "I see," Douglas finally said. His tone was unreadable. "You didn't know, did you?" Van asked. "No, I didn't," Douglas replied, after another pause. "I hadn't heard Rose's name in months. Carolina said she left on her own terms." Van scoffed. "She didn't leave. She was pushed out, manipulated, forced out by your sister, my aunt." Douglas sighed, the weariness seeping into his voice. "Come to the house." The stately Wellington estate in Westchester County was quieter than usual when Van arrived. Inside, Douglas was already waiting in his study, seated beside the same fireplace where generations of Wellingtons had made business deals and issued decrees. Van didn't sit. "She destroyed Rose's career," Van said bluntly, pacing the floor. "And she did it with full intent, because she didn't want your name, our name, tied to someone she didn't approve of." Douglas studied his son, a glass of brandy untouched on the table beside him. "And the child?" Van swallowed hard. "She's due in a few weeks. A boy." Douglas looked toward the window, lips pressed into a line. "And you're certain?" "I've seen the sonograms. I've held her while he kicked. I've read the fear in her eyes and felt it in her silence. I should have known something was wrong. I left her alone to face this, and while I was gone, Carolina made sure she disappeared." Douglas rubbed his hands together, slowly, as if working through the weight of everything Van had said. Then he stood. "I'll call Carolina," he said. Van turned sharply. "What are you going to say?" "I'm going to do what I should have done a long time ago," Douglas replied. "I'm going to put family before business, for once." Within the hour, Carolina Wellington was summoned to the estate. She arrived impeccably dressed, as always. Gray tailored pantsuit, pearl earrings, hair pinned into a flawless chignon. She walked into the sitting room like she owned it. pausing only when she saw Van leaning against the mantel. Douglas stood by the liquor cabinet, hands folded behind his back. "What's this about?" Carolina asked coolly. Douglas turned to face her. "Van has something to tell you. And then I expect you to explain yourself." Carolina's gaze shifted to Van, unflinching. He didn't blink. "Rose is pregnant. She's carrying my son. She was 2 months along when you forced her out." Carolina arched one brow. "And? You didn't think that was relevant to share?" Van asked, stepping forward. "Yes," she replied smoothly. "Even if she wasn't pregnant, it wouldn't have changed my decision." Douglas's brow furrowed. "You said she resigned, that there was nothing more to it." "I said what needed to be said," Carolina answered. "I kept the company clean." Douglas stepped forward. "Did you push her out because you didn't believe the child was Van's, or because you thought both of them were in the way?" Carolina turned slowly toward her brother. "Both. She was a distraction. Van has responsibilities. Our family has a legacy. He should be with someone of a certain standard." Van's voice sharpened. "So you decided that my child, his grandchild, and the woman I love weren't good enough to carry our name?" Carolina didn't flinch. "I decided to protect the Wellington brand from emotional entanglements. You were falling for someone who would only weaken your focus." Douglas's voice, low and quiet, sliced through the room. "You've done a lot for this family, Carolina, but you don't get to define who's worthy of it. Not anymore." The silence afterward was cold and deep. Carolina stood slowly. "If you want to throw everything away for a girl and a child that weakens your image, go ahead, but don't expect me to clean up the mess." She walked out, head high, but kingdom crumbling. The first article dropped on a Wednesday morning. It appeared on a major digital news outlet with the headline, "Whistleblower Reveals Internal Corruption at Wellington Global. Pregnant Executive Forced Out by Legal Powerhouse." Beneath the title was a detailed exposé, outlining how Carolina Wellington, the company's iron-fisted legal chief, had orchestrated a smear campaign against Rose Keaton, a junior executive in a secret relationship with Van Wellington, heir to the corporate throne. It wasn't anonymous. Karen Ellis had attached her name to every statement. A photo of her and Rose from college days was included. 2 women beaming on graduation day. Now one worked for the mayor and the other had nearly lost everything. Karen's testimony was meticulous. Timelines, emails she'd been blind copied on, conversations she overheard in Wellington's Chicago office, the pressure she'd faced to cut ties with Rose or suffer career consequences. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, #JusticeForRose was trending on every platform. The public backlash against Wellington Global was immediate. Major clients began issuing statements of concern. Internal whistleblowers came forward with their own accounts of Carolina's long history of behind-the-scenes purges. At the Wellington estate, Carolina sat motionless, watching the coverage unfold in silence. For the first time in years, she looked tired. Douglas stood across the room, arms folded. "Anything you want to say before the board votes to remove you?" She turned to him slowly. "I did what you never had the courage to do. You built the image, Douglas. I preserved it. If I fell on the sword for the family name, I'd do it again." "No," Douglas said, his voice firm. "You didn't fall on the sword. You used it on a woman who was never a threat, and a child who never asked to be part of our legacy." By Friday, Carolina resigned publicly under the pressure of an internal investigation and the growing outrage from investors. Her statement was cold, deflective, and devoid of remorse. But it didn't matter. Her reign was over. Wellington Global's legal team, now under new leadership, reached out to Rose with a proposed settlement. It included a formal letter of apology signed by the board, a 7-figure payout, and the option to return to her position, though she politely declined the last offer. She didn't want their desk. She wanted her dignity, and she got it. With her name cleared and her reputation not only intact but strengthened by public sympathy and respect, offers began pouring in. consulting gigs, leadership roles, panel invitations. But Rose wasn't in a rush. She had other priorities now. In the soft light of a spring morning, Rose stood in the nursery, rocking her son gently to sleep. His little eyes fluttered shut as she hummed under her breath. The chaos of the outside world faded into nothing against the weight of his tiny heartbeat. Van leaned against the doorway, watching her quietly. "He's finally asleep?" he asked in a low voice. She smiled, nodding. "He fights it like you do." Van chuckled. "He has my temper, your eyes, and my inability to shut up." She stepped closer, placing the baby into his arms. "And he has our love. That's more than enough." They sat together for a while, neither speaking, the warmth between them speaking louder than words. Finally, Van broke the silence. "There's something I want to ask you." Rose gave him a look. "You already did that," she said, glancing down at the subtle diamond ring on her hand. He grinned. "No, not about marriage, about legacy." He stood, pacing slowly. "I've been thinking about starting over. Not just walking away from Wellington Global, but building something new, something better, a company that doesn't protect predators or punish integrity. One where the next generation, our son, can be proud of our name." Rose watched him quietly. "What would it look like?" "Clean funding," he said. "Transparent governance. Employee-led equity models. Family support policies. No tolerance for discrimination or exploitation. A space where smart people lead with ethics first." "And you want to do it with me?" Van nodded. "I don't just want to do it with you. I can't do it without you." Her eyes filled, but her voice remained strong. "Then let's build it. Not for revenge, not to prove anything. Let's build it so no one has to survive what I went through." He reached out and touched her cheek. "We're building a future." "No," she whispered. "We're building a new name." Months later, the official launch of Keaton and Wellington Collective Ventures was held in a small, intimate venue filled with community leaders, startup founders, and industry disruptors. There were no champagne towers, no red carpet, just a stage, a baby in the arms of a proud grandfather, and Rose Keaton standing confidently behind the podium. She began her speech without notes. "I was erased by a company that claimed to stand for progress," she said. "But instead of staying quiet, I chose to rewrite the ending. Not alone, but with people who believe in rebuilding, not just rebranding. This company is not a second chance. It's a first chance to do things right." The applause was thunderous in the crowd. Karen wiped a tear, clapping harder than anyone. Douglas stood tall beside Van, holding his grandson, eyes misted over with something like pride, and maybe a bit of regret. And Van? He watched the woman he loved take back her power in front of the world, and knew with certainty she had never been the distraction. She was always the purpose. 3 years later, fresh coffee filled the kitchen of a modern brownstone nestled in Brooklyn Heights. Light streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow on hardwood floors, pastel scribbles taped to the fridge, and a tiny pair of sneakers kicked off beside a toy truck. Rose Wellington, formerly Keaton, stood barefoot in the kitchen, her long curls pinned up, sleeves rolled past her elbows as she poured pancake batter into a hot skillet. She wore no makeup, just one of Van's old t-shirts and a pair of soft leggings. But the confidence in her stance and the ease in her smile made her more radiant than she'd ever been in a boardroom. From the hallway came the unmistakable patter of toddler feet. "Mommy, where's Bunny?" Leo, their 3-year-old son, rushed in clutching a stuffed dinosaur, face scrunched in concern. "In the reading nook where you left him," Rose replied without looking, flipping a pancake. Leo zipped off just as Van appeared behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pressing a kiss to her neck. "Morning, Mrs. Wellington." She smirked. "You're only sweet when there's food involved." "Not true," he said, stealing a piece of crispy bacon. "I'm sweet when you wear my t-shirts too." Later that morning, the family strolled down to K&W Collective Ventures, their boutique investment firm, now 3 years old and thriving. Housed in a renovated warehouse, the company was built on the same pillars they vowed to uphold: ethics, equity, transparency, and human-first leadership. They funded community-minded startups, minority-owned businesses, and green tech initiatives. Every employee held equity. Every mother had paid leave. Every voice was heard. Van now served as head of strategy, while Rose, gracefully balancing motherhood and leadership, was co-CEO. Their mission wasn't to dominate the market, but to reshape it. The glass conference room buzzed with gentle energy that afternoon as Rose stepped up to address their staff, cradling a warm cup of tea. 3 years ago, she began. This was an idea, scribbled in a notebook during one of the hardest chapters of my life. I was homeless, pregnant, and told I had no future in business. Today, we've invested in 47 startups, created over 500 jobs, and helped dozens of working parents stay in the game without sacrificing family. The room erupted in soft applause. In the front row, Van beamed, Leo perched on his lap, chewing a granola bar. Later, Van pulled Rose aside. "I was thinking," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "It's been a while since we took a real break. No emails, no pitches, just the beach, sand, sun, tiny footprints." Rose grinned. "You want to run away?" He nodded. "For a little while, before baby number 2 gets here." Rose's brows lifted. "You're assuming I'm pregnant again?" "I'm hoping," he whispered. She leaned in, kissed him softly, then murmured, "You've got about 7 months to plan that vacation, Daddy." Van froze, then laughed and swept her into his arms, spinning her in the middle of the office as their staff cheered. That night, Rose sat alone in Leo's room after bedtime, watching him sleep. The moonlight illuminated his soft curls, his little fingers curled into fists. So much had changed. She had once been erased, professionally, personally, and now she was writing her name into every space she walked into. Not with anger, with legacy. From the doorway, Van whispered, "You okay?" She nodded. "I was just thinking, how beautiful it feels when your story doesn't end in survival, but in becoming." He reached for her hand. "You became everything I never knew I needed." They walked down the hallway, hand in hand, their son asleep, their daughter growing, and their future unfolding, one honest step at a time. The end. Thanks for listening to Green Tea Tales. Help our channel grow with likes, shares, and subscribers.